Hello, and we are back. We are in Unit 7 under the stress section of this unit. Okay, so you're going to put up at the top stress notes. Please make sure to pause because it will go pretty fast. I'm going to try to talk as quickly as possible, and then follow along on these notes. They're kind of just a basis of what the subtopics can be. Obviously, there's going to be more information that is in here, so please just don't think it's 3 bullets and that's it. Okay, so please make sure that you are pausing the video to get all the information. All right, so first one is the stress, some basic concepts of what is stress. So the first one is stress. What is it? It is a mental, so it's a cognitive, and physical condition that happens when a person encounters some demand or an expectation, and then they must adjust or adapt to the environment. Okay, so next bullet, stress can be negative, and if it's a negative, it's called a distress. So DI stress. And then if it's a positive, which motivates you, forces you to accomplish or achieve a goal, and that would be called a eustress. All right. Now, so typically stress arises, as your next bullet, arises not so much from the event itself, but more about how we appraise it, which is just how we think about it. And appraise, just so a little refresher from the theories of emotions, appraisal theory comes from Lazarus. Okay, he is the psychologist that had the appraisal theory of emotion. And so this goes back on that concept is that stress, it's not so much an event that's what causes the stress, but more of how we perceive that event or that moment. Um, Now, obviously, what they say is experiencing, next little bullet, experiencing some stress in early life can lead to building resilience as you get older. People that don't experience any type of stress have a harder time as they become an adult that has a lot more stressors. They tend to not have as much resilience as those that have dealt with stress in the past. So those are you guys. Okay. However, extreme or prolonged stress can also harm you, not just cognitively, right, our mental health, but also our physical health. We'll talk a little bit about that. Next little thing under basic concepts are stressors. Stressors are basically any type of condition or event in the environment that challenges or threatens a person. Okay. And again, stressors are going to be different for everybody because it's all about the perception. Okay, now there are 3 types of stressors, 3 main types, which are basically the catastrophes, which are just basically anything that is an unpredictable large scale event. Okay, the next little not subtopic, next bullet is that after the event, the damage is typically like the emotion or physical health. So this is typically hurricanes, floods, storms, tornadoes, right? That you're going to like lose something big, and it's usually in a larger scale. It's not just you're the only one that was affected by it. Now this does with catastrophes, this one typically declines over time, and as the process, things start getting fixed, back to normal, things like that, starts reducing the stress. Okay. The next one is life changes or significant life changes, and this is anything that basically deals with life transitions, a loss of somebody, a divorce, you move away, right? This is typically happens during young adulthood. A lot more of these things happen, which is why there's a lot more stressors or stressed people when they're in college, young adults. Um, that's during that time. Okay, next one is the last one, which is the daily problems or social stresses. And this can be any type of stressors that they can add up, or it's like on a constant. Um, they typically, this could be anything from you lose your phone to too much homework to fitting in, things like that. Um, So those are the three major stressors. Okay. Now we're going to move on to the stress response system. And stress response system deals with basically it is, and the first little bullet is going to be the arousal of your autonomic nervous system. Okay, and this is your sympathetic nervous system that gets activated, or the parasympathetic. They are both combined there. Now, the arousal is what leads you to fight or flight. Okay, now when we're in fight or flight mode, it's your sympathetic nervous system. This is your next bullet. Sympathetic nervous system arouses, and then it prepares the body for fight or flight. Please write this down so you know what happens when your body is in your sympathetic nervous system is activated, okay? So this is where it increases your heart rate, your respiration, breathing. It diverts the blood from your digestion to your skeletal muscles, and then pain releases sugar, so you could increase the energy levels and chances of survival. Okay, now obviously we do not always want to be in sympathetic. That is why we have the parasympathetic, that is to calm the system down. Okay, now this little thing right here, this we call it GAS, or general adaptation syndrome, is really, really important. They love to use this on the AP test, and they'll use general adaptation syndrome. So it's your general way of adapting to stress. Okay. And the guy's name is Hans Seil. And so he basically said he was an endocrinologist that wanted to study how your body responds to stress. And he says there are 3 stages, okay, that we go through in response to stressors. That should be your first bullet. It's your first response, or this is your body's way of responding to stressors in 3 ways, okay? Now, this is your body's way of dealing with temporary stress, but if we do this, prolonged stress can actually be very damaging, okay? So please note of that. Now, the first one is called the alarm reaction. You may want to get these little graphs too and put them on the side so you could draw them out. Good idea to understand this. An alarm reaction is basically when the person appraises the stressors, which think about the stressors, first bullet, and mobilizes its resources to cope with the stressor. Okay, so this is where your next bullet, sympathetic nervous system, is activated and it's ready to go, right? It's either fight or flight. So your heart rate goes up, your skeletal, the blood goes to your skeletal systems, right? So it's that way of getting ready to fight or flight. Then you go on to the resistance, and this is where the person tries to cope with the stressors, okay? So this is where their temperature, blood pressure, and respirations remain really high so that they could continue fighting or fleeing. The next bullet, the adrenal glands pumps hormones into the bloodstream, and we'll talk about those. And that's basically the adrenal gland sends out the adrenaline, the noradrenaline, and most importantly, cortisol is the other one. So adrenaline, if those are the 2 you're going to remember, the hormones, is going to be the adrenaline and cortisol, okay? What cortisol has to do with your digestion. So make sure to put that in there, okay? And then the last section of the GAS, general adaptation syndrome, is going to be exhaustion. And this is where basically the person's energy has been depleted. All of their energy resources have been depleted. The body starts shutting down, and it's informing the person no more energy to fight this stressor. And this is usually why we either get really, really sick, we can get really sick, or get really, really tired and sleepy. Now, if we do not listen to our bodies and allow the parasympathetic nervous system to do its work, then we can basically deplete all of our resources, which can lead into what's called burnout. Okay, and this is not part of the 3 stages. This is kind of like what happens if we're constantly in this cycle. And that is burnout. And burnout is a physical, mental, and or emotional exhaustion. And this is basically where it's not just that you're you're stressed out, this is that literally you cannot move or do anything. You can't think, can't move your body, none of that. Okay. This is can typically happens with prolonged long-term repeated exposure to stressors. Make sure to write that down. And it may get you sick because your immune system has basically, it's very, very weak. Okay. And this burnout typically happens with careers that or professions that are in the helping industry, like teachers, nurses, doctors, things like that, psychologists as well. You'll get a lot of burnout because they're constantly helping others and they're stressors. Okay. All right. So here comes the next one, which is the biology of chronic stress. And this is going to go a little bit into Hans Siles, and I already wrote his name before, but that's the guy. And he, like I said before, he was an endocrinologist and he was studying our body's response to stress. Okay, so I wrote down some keywords here just to give you an idea of how to spell them. But please do not just write that as your notes because that is not the notes. Okay, all right. So, what he found out was that when we are approached with a stressor, the amygdala is the first one that gets activated, which the amygdala is the one that deals with our feelings. Once the amygdala recognizes the threat, okay, make a little arrow, it sends a signal to the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus is in the brain that basically connects with the pituitary, where they work together, and it tells the pituitary gland, hey, sends a signal to the adrenal gland. Now, write this down too, that the pituitary gland is your master gland, and that's the one that kind of tells all the glands what to do. And so it sends a message to the adrenal, and then the adrenal gland releases its hormone. Remember that these guys right here are part of the endocrine system, which is where your hormones are stored. Endocrine. Spelled that all wrong, but you know. Write it down. And the hormones are going to be adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol. Okay, so the two really, adrenaline and cortisol, just try to remember those two will be just fine. Okay, and those get released into the system to then activate the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, now stress and diseases. And obviously, as you guys have heard many, many times, stress can be very harmful to our physical and mental health. Now, health psychologists, and write that down, health psychology or health psychology is basically the study of stress and how it affects our minds and body. So people that actually are interested in this field, you could go into what's called health psychology, and this is what they focus on a lot more, which is of how psychology and the body kind of work together and how it affects one another. Okay. Now, one thing you need to know about stress is that if it persists, it will basically increase your increase the inability to fight diseases. Okay, because your nervous system and endocrine system are basically fighting or constantly working, which doesn't allow for your immune system to be kicked in, which is what fights the diseases, okay, or any type of and forgot what I was going to say, but you guys hopefully know what immune system is. So when we are in a constant stress, our immune system doesn't work properly. And it's basically what starts happening is that our body starts attacking its own tissues, which many times leads to this autoimmune diseases such as multiple sclerosis, lupus. So people that are really, really stressed can lead a lot of times to these autoimmune diseases. Why it's so important to be not so stressed, okay? Now, it also can trigger immune suppression, which is basically it reduces the release of disease fighting, which is called the I'll write it down, lymphocytes. And I don't know how much of the science word you need to know, but you need to understand that's a why. Is that it doesn't allow sorry. It releases when we are stressed. It releases I forgot what I was saying. Sorry. It reduces the release of these lymphocytes. Okay. Which is why when we're really, really stressed, we tend to get really sick. And then that's what basically forces us to get into that parasympathetic and get a lot more sleep, so that our cells can replenish itself. Okay, now stress can also increase your risk of cancer. However, stress does not create cancer cells, it just increases the risk. And then a biggie for stress and constant stress is heart diseases. So there is huge links to coronary heart diseases with constant stress, because obviously your heart, when you are in stress, your fight or flight, your sympathetic is pumping a lot of blood, it's working extra, and so why it's linked to that heart disease. And then, of course, it also creates inflammation, and inflammation, um, which when stress, it triggers your blood vessels, okay, to become inflamed, and it's constantly, and then that inflammation fights the infection. But if you are inflamed, then it's not able to fight the infection, okay, which just basically causes more problems such as asthma, arteries are being clogged, okay, it could worsen depression. So it's just it's a spiral effect with stress, okay. Now, the effects of stressors on your different types of personality, okay, and there are two types of, I mean, there's a lot more apparently now. There's like type C, I don't know, combination. Anyway, but for here, you need to know there's type A and there's type B. Type A personality, you've probably heard of it, are people that tend to be very competitive, hard driven, impatient. They tend to be a little bit more verbally aggressive. They get angry a little bit easier. Now, these type A personality, they tend to be a little bit more on higher risk of heart diseases. They tend to be a little bit more stressed than normal, than others. Okay. Then type B is more of an easygoing, relaxed person. They have less of a risk of heart disease. And so that's pretty much it for that. Okay. Now, there's also what's called coping with stressors. How do we deal with all these stressors? Wouldn't we like to know? Yes. All right, so I'm gonna give you a couple of them. There is here on this section, I do want you to write coping with stress. So there is their direct coping, which is intentionally making an effort to change an uncomfortable situation, directly dealing with it. There's confrontation, acknowledging the stress directly. Compromising, right? Choosing a more realistic goal. And then there's also withdrawal, where you're just avoiding the situation altogether. Okay, so these are ways directly coping with them. Now, there is also what is called emotion focus, and I want you to write that as well on the side. And emotion focused is when you're controlling or replacing negative emotional response to stressors. Okay, so this is when you're just changing your emotions, your negative emotions, to the stressor. Okay. Um, and that could be, instead of saying, well, let's say, for example, you have homework, you have a ton of homework, you're like, oh my God, I can't do this, it's too much. You could be like, okay, I could do this. I know if I see it as something bad, I'm gonna keep on seeing it as bad. And just kind of focusing on this is good for me. I think that one's hard to do for homework, but you get the idea of trying to make sure that you're just changing the negative emotion around it. It's like this limiting beliefs, right? These thoughts behind it, throwing it more of a positive emotion. All right, the next one is the problem focused coping, and this is basically just managing and fixing distressing situations, like just fixing the problem, right? Do your homework. Stop procrastinating and, watching TV or cleaning your room to avoid the homework. Just go and do it. And then appraisal focused coping is that you're reframing the stressor. You're changing one's perception and assumptions about the stressors. Okay, instead of saying, oh my gosh, all this homework, it's more like, okay, like it's really not that much. I could do this in an hour, 30 minutes, and that's it. Okay, it's more like the way that you think, your perception around um, that. Okay, and the last thing I want you to look at is methods of reducing stress. So there are many different ways. I just want to talk about a couple that are effective. And a lot of it, I think, has to start with your thought process, right? This positive reappraisal, which is basically thinking of it in things as not as catastrophic or so negative, or just more like, like this is what I need to do. It's really not a big deal. I will get over it. Like I will be able to fulfill this or do this. Okay. So just a lot of the thought behind it, your appraisal, your perception on it goes a long way. Humor, obviously. Humor is always a great thing. Also, calming down. How do we calm down? Exercise is the number one thing to de-stress and make, like, for your health, for your mental health, just exercise. And exercise can literally be a walk outside. It does not have to be an extraneous going to the gym. It could just be as simple as dancing in your room, walking, going outside, stretching, yoga, anything that you like, strength training, anything, run, walk, whatever it may be. Okay. A relaxation training also is a great one. There's different forms of it. There could be yoga, relaxation music. There could be different types of music that also are relaxing. So there's just different ways what works for you. Like for me, guided meditation doesn't work. But other forms of meditation with music, with different types of music, assist me. Religion is another big one. Religious groups, support groups also help, um, like social support networks. And then altruism, which is giving to others because it gives you pleasure, right? Like helping others, community, people using, having people in your community is so important. Okay, and that's basically it for the notes. I did want to continue on. This is a stress worksheet that I gave you, and I kind of just wanted to talk a little bit about what I want you to write on there. And what does it all mean? So basically, the stressor, which is the mountain at the top, is basically your external event. And write that here at the top. It'll be your external event that something's always going to stress you out, right? There's always going to be a stressor in the external world. And you could have what's called the primary appraisal. And you're going to write that here in the little section of the thing. And it's just, um, if we're looking at something, an event, as positive or neutral or negative. Okay, sorry about that. So if we're seeing a situation as something positive, neutral, or negative, it's going to implicate, it's going to affect the way that we respond to it. Okay, so obviously if it's something that is negative that could harm us, it can obviously cause us more stress, right? And it gets us into that sympathetic. But if we look at it in a way that it's like, okay, this is not catastrophic, I could deal with this type of stressor, then, typically you're able to use your resources wisely. Okay. Then there's that secondary appraisal that happens up here on this side. Start looking at what are our coping skills, what are our abilities, what can we do to fix this, these stressors, right? So if we think like this is catastrophic, oh my gosh, we have no control over this, then we tend to be less helpless, hopeless, really, and then it creates more of a stressor within the stressor. So it's always good to be like, wait a minute, I have the tools, or where can I find the tools to deal with this stressor in order to move on, right? So that we don't get stuck in this whirlwind of just stressed and that sympathetic system constantly going. Okay. And then this is kind of like where, if we're here and we believe that we cannot, right, deal with these stressors, then we're going to get sick. If we're in chronic stress, the physiological, both psychological, are also really negative. Okay. And a side little note that I do want you, if we see this word acute stress, which is basically acute stress is something that we can all deal with, which is just stress that life gives us. Okay. Chronic stress is where we're in that constant whirlwind of stress. All right. And that's basically it for this. I hope this helped. See you later.